Hello. Today we're going to do episode 2 of the Esoteric Winnipeg series. And this episode will be all about first covering Manitoba's Freemasonic history and how important Freemasonry is to Manitoba as a province of Canada. And then we will be going into how that carries over into the esoteric architecture and symbolism inside of the Manitoba Legislative building. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the first thing that we have to understand about Manitoba and Freemasonry is the origin of the province itself. Before Manitoba existed, there was a period of time in the 16 and 1700s where a group of people named the Coureurs du Bois, which translates from French as the runners of the woods, they were fur traders and they lived in the region, and they traded with the indigenous people and eventually settled down and intermarried with the indigenous people, and together that would create a new distinct people known as the Métis. So the Métis people lived in this region of Manitoba for hundreds of years before Canada existed as its own country. So they lived in a region known as Rupert's Land, and Rupert's Land would have been this gigantic area which includes a lot of the modern day provinces, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. So we'll get into the actual history of Manitoba now. So the Red River Rebellion or Resistance in 1869 to 1870 was a Métis uprising, what is now Manitoba, Canada, led by Louis Riel, this guy. This was sparked by the Hudson Bay Company's sale of Rupert's Land to Canada without the Métis consultation, because remember, the Métis lived in what is now considered Rupert's Land. The resistance aimed to protect Métis rights, land rights, and culture. Riel formed a provisional government and demanded recognition of Métis rights, leading to negotiations that resulted in the Manitoba Act and Manitoba's entry into the Confederation as a province. So as we talked here, the Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land to the Dominion of Canada, including the Red River Settlement, which is where Winnipeg is now, without the consent of the Métis residents. The Métis feared losing their land, culture, and way of life under the new Canadian government. So this resulted in a brief civil war, which was not very long, about a year long, but the Red River Rebellion fought against the Canadians, who were actually the British at the time. It's still today part of the constitutional monarchy of Britain, but at the time it was actual British troops moving across Canada to different forts that they had set up throughout the different Canadian provinces as we know them today. And they essentially were trying to take the land from the Métis people by force, and they fought back. After a few skirmishes, they won against the forces, at least in the sense that they were able to push them back and to negotiate for the provisional government. Riel and the Métis formed a provisional government to negotiate their entry into Canada on their own terms. So they still were brought into the Federation, and that was the origin of Manitoba, because after all of this negotiation, after the fighting, that's when the conflict concluded with the passage of the Manitoba Act, which brought Manitoba into the Canadian Federation as a province in 1870. So, let's go to the next slide here and we'll see why everything here is very important. So, organized Freemasonry in Manitoba began in 1864 with the Northern Light Lodge and was led by figures like John Christian Schultz. By 1875, 3 lodges formed the Grand Lodge of Manitoba, which initially governed the craft across the Northwest and Yukon territories. The organization focused on moral betterment and civic engagement, with its members contributing to the community projects and charities. This whole thing, it's debatable in my opinion, but let's continue on. Notable instances of Freemason influence include the design of the Manitoba Legislative building with its Masonic symbolism and the construction of the first Masonic temple in Winnipeg in 1895. So the first contact, the first time the Freemasons were ever in what is now Manitoba, was when they were in the Red River settlement, and this goes back to 1813 with the arrival of John Palmer Bourke. The first lodge, Northern Light Lodge, was established in the fall of 1864 by prominent figures including John Schultz and A.G.B. Bannatyne. So remember Bannatyne because he's very important, as well as Schultz to some degree, but Bannatyne is actually part of the government, and we'll discuss that when we go into this other blurb here from the Manitoba Historic Society. 3 local lodges came together on May 12th, 1875 to form the Grand Lodge of Manitoba, with William C. Clark as its first Grand Master. That's also important because William C. Clark was another politician. Many early provincial leaders and the architect of the Manitoba Legislative building were, and the building itself is rich with Masonic symbolism. Specifically, every Manitoba premier from 1872 to 1966 and nearly every person involved in the construction of the legislature were Freemasons. Remember that. Just think about that for a second. From 1872 to 1966, and today I believe there's still a trend going on. It was broken, but there's still Freemasons in government in Manitoba and as the mayor of Winnipeg, etc. For that 100-year period almost, every single person that ran Manitoba was a Freemason, part of this Grand Lodge of Manitoba. By 1864, by 1864, 2 Freemasons were living in the settlement. John Christian Schultz, who played such a prominent part in the early history of our province, and Charles Curtis, who was a blacksmith in the Sturgeon Creek area, and he was married to Cecilia, a daughter of John, and Mary Inkster of Seven Oaks House, West Kildonan. These 2 Freemasons, Schultz and Curtis, early in 1864, sponsored 5 prominent local men, namely A.G.B. and G.B. Bannatyne, A.G.B. Bannatyne, William Inkster, W.B. Hall, Robert Morgan, and William Coldwell, in Northern Light Lodge at Pembina, North Dakota. These 7 Freemasons, on their return to the settlement, the Red River settlement, together with one recent arrival, Matthew Conaire, petitioned the Grand Lodge of Minnesota to sponsor a lodge in the Red River settlement. This request was granted by renewing the dispensation to the military lodge at the Pembina, only removing its place of meeting to the Red River settlement. This was possible as the cavalry detachment at Pembina was being moved away. The lodge was active for the first few years, but ceased to exist either in 1868 or 1869 owing to the troubles in the settlement that culminated in the Riel affair. The actual or original petition, dated 27th of April 1864 and written in longhand by A.G.B. Bannatyne, was presented to us in 1955 by the Grand Lodge of Minnesota. The writing and signatures on this document are still quite legible. Remember, all of this is coming from the Manitoba Historic Society, so that's when they say us, that's who they're referring to. In 1870, 3 months after the Wolseley expedition had arrived in the settlement to deal with the so-called Riel provincial government, 9 Freemasons from among the troops applied to the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario for the dispensation to form a lodge to be known as the Winnipeg Lodge to meet at Fort Garry. The dispensation was granted under the date of the 21st November 1860. Before a charter was granted to the lodge, requested its name to change to Prince Rupert's Lodge, and in 1871 a charter was issued under this name and number 240 under the registry of the Grand Lodge in Canada and Ontario. The names of the 9 charter members will interest you, as many of them and their descendants became prominent as the years went by. They are Robert Stewart Patterson, who was a Champlain to the forces. William N. Kennedy was a lieutenant. Matthew Cohn was a sergeant major. E. Armstrong was a quartermaster. D.M. Walker was a lieutenant. A.R. MacDonald was a surgeon. James T.B. Morris was a paymaster. Henry Champion was also connected with the forces, and Norman J. Dingman, who received his military discharge and had returned to Eastern Canada before the dispensation reached Fort Garry. So, this is very important, all this information. It's a lot to take in, but essentially after the Riel affair, which is when that's the Red River Uprising, the Red River Rebellion with the Métis uprising against the British forces. After that was quashed, essentially, the new provisional government that was formed was then inundated with Freemasons, and then also they moved the military into the fort there, which was Fort Garry, where Winnipeg, it's still a part of Winnipeg today. They moved their troops there, and the troops all joined into the Freemasons. So the first thing that happened in Manitoba when the provisional government was created is that it was inundated with Freemasons, and then the military was inundated with Freemasons. And so it's no surprise why Louis Riel was killed by these people. He was executed for treason. Um, it makes a lot of sense then that they wanted to get rid of the prominent leader of the Métis people, who was Métis in nationality, so that they could then continue on running the province without his influence, without him being the true leader of Manitoba anymore. So that's a little bit about the origin of Manitoba in general, going from the Métis people in the region in Louis Riel, and then coming here to how Freemasonry kind of took over the province and with organization through the government and military. So now we'll talk about one other thing about Freemasons and the early days of the legislative building, and how there was a gigantic fraud and embezzlement scheme that played out with this building. So let's just go into it here. Thomas Kelly was a Winnipeg contractor involved in a major political scandal during the construction of the Manitoba Legislative Building between 1913 and 1920. His fraudulent overcharging and illicit payments to the provincial premier led to the downfall of the Conservative government at the time. Details of the scandal. The initial contract. In 1913, the contract for constructing the new legislative building was awarded to Thomas Kelly and his sons. It was the largest single building contract in Canadian history. So remember that. This building here, the Manitoba Legislative Building, even to this day, is the largest single building contract in Canadian history for one building. The fraud charges. Kelly fraudulently overcharged the Manitoba government for hundreds of thousands of dollars for the work and kicked a portion of the money back to the Conservative Party under Premier Rodmond Roblin. Concealment and discovery. Government officials destroyed documents and bribed a witness to flee the country to cover up their actions. However, after the irregularities became too large to ignore, a royal commission was launched. This royal commission investigated the construction, found the province had overpaid Thomas Kelly and Sons $892,098.10. In today's dollars, that would be worth $19.5 million that they embezzled. Much of this money was then funneled into an election fund for the Conservative Party. There's some more information here about the whole context of this. There was a scandal involving fraud and embezzlement during the construction of the Manitoba Legislative Building in the early 1910s, which we know was 1913 to 1920, leading to the resignation of Premier Rodman Roblin and the imprisonment of contractor Thomas Kelly. He went to prison for this. The scandal involved a scheme to use the building's construction to fund a secret political slush fund. The myth of the pilfered pillars is now considered a misconception, though fraud did occur. So the pilfered pillars is, there was this rumor going around that Thomas Kelly, the architect, was stealing materials to build his own house. This has apparently been debunked. It's still an interesting story, but that was part of the whole thing of the fraud and embezzlement, as well as materials being stolen, was part of the story. The Roblin scandal. In March 1915, claims of corruption during the construction of the new legislative building emerged, resulting in the Roblin administration. The scandal involved a conspiracy to funnel money from the building's construction into a secret election fund. The scandal led to Premier Roblin's resignation, and the contractor Thomas Kelly spent 2.5 years in prison. So again, if we talk about the last 3 slides all together as one continuum here, we're talking about a brief civil war that started Manitoba between the Métis and the English. We have them creating a provisional government, and then that being subverted by the Freemasons through the military and through the government by introducing their own people and putting them all around the place, and then becoming the premier from that point forward for almost 100 years. And lastly, we have this gigantic contract, the biggest single building contract in Canadian history, and it all being an embezzlement scheme to siphon funds into the conservative government at the time. And this guy probably got very rich off of it too, Thomas Kelly. So the building itself and the history of Manitoba itself is filled with these shady Freemasonic actions to get us to where we are today. So let's move into the actual building itself now that we know the history of Freemasons in Manitoba and the building itself. So we're just going to go in order of how you would see the building, as like when you're walking into it and you're walking up to it, what you would see first, like what your eyes would glance on, maybe what your eyes won't glance on, but the first thing that you will see is the pediment here. If we go here, you can see the pediment is this triangular part here. And what's in that pediment is actually, there's the Greek god Athena sitting on a chair. And what's interesting about Athena here is what she has in her lap, which is the fasces. We'll go into that in a second. So there's a bust of the Greek goddess Athena, a symbol of democracy and the protector of the cities, is located inside the Manitoba Legislative building in Winnipeg. It's one of the many symbolic and allegorical figures incorporated into the building's architecture by its Freemasonic designer, Frank Worthington Simon. So alongside Athena here, you can also see that there's a picture of Medusa. So when you first walk in and you get into the building, the first thing you'll see is this archway that has all these stones, and Medusa is in the middle of those stones staring at you. They say that Medusa is there to ward off evil. That's their excuse they give. But there's kind of a little mythological analogy here, right? So Athena, who they say is the symbol of democracy, she's also associated with justice and liberty, the scales of justice, things like that. The story with her and Medusa is that Medusa actually, in the mythology, gets raped by Poseidon, and she's a priestess of Athena. So, and Poseidon rapes her inside of Athena's temple. Figuring this out, Athena doesn't get mad at Poseidon for what she did to Medusa. Instead, she condemns Medusa, she persecutes her by converting her into a monster, a Gorgon snake monster, for defiling her temple. So even though Athena is always associated with liberty, democracy, justice, things like that, she kind of seems like an asshole when you think about it, because especially with what she did to Medusa and what she does in the mythology, that's definitely not very fair and just to do what she did to Medusa in the mythology. And I think that's very interesting, considering that here she is sitting here, right? And in her lap she's got the fasces. So we'll come over here. I made this years ago, this little slide here. So the fasces, a plural tandem from the Latin word fascis, meaning a bundle, Italian fascicio literario, is a bundle of wooden rods, sometimes including an axe, with its blade emerging. Origin of the word fascism. So these things would be carried around by servants of the tyrant, of the emperor in Rome, and it's a symbol of tyrannical control and totalitarianism. So it's very interesting that Athena is sitting on the chair here, where apparently it's supposed to represent democracy, but she's carrying a symbol of totalitarianism. This was before the word fascism was created, by the way. When Mussolini first created the first fascist party in Italy, he named fascism after the fasces because he believed that it represented ultimate government control and authority. That's why he called fascism fascism. So on to the next slide. So the next thing that you'll see is just above her here is the Ark of the Covenant, which is actually the war chest. at the Manitoba Legislative building is a symbolic war chest located above the Lieutenant Governor's office. This is interesting. A room designed to parallel the proportions of the Holy of Holies in King Solomon's Temple, which is 66.6 feet by 66.6 feet. Remember that, 666 is a number there. The chest, flanked by a Native American warrior and a Roman centurion, is representation of the biblical Ark of the Covenant and serves as a central element in the building's intricate Masonic-inspired design, which incorporates symbols of wisdom, commerce, and the land. So again, this is directly above the Lieutenant Governor's office. The design is that the chest itself has the dimensions of the biblical Ark of the Covenant, so it's the same exact size as what the Ark of the Covenant would have been. It has two guardians, like the Ark of the Covenant had two guardians, flanked by statues of two warriors, a Native American chief and the Roman centurion. We'll go into here what the Ark of the Covenant is for a second, if people don't know what that is, which I'm pretty sure most people will. But the Ark of the Covenant is a sacred golden-plated wooden chest mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament that held the Ten Commandments etched on stone tablets. It symbolizes God's presence among the ancient Israelites. Described as a powerful artifact, the Ark was carried through the wilderness into battles, and it was housed in the tabernacle and later the Temple of Jerusalem, but it vanished during the Babylonian sack of the city in 586 BC. So there's another connection to Babylon here with the Babylonian sack of Jerusalem. We were talking in episode 1 about how the downtown region, the market region, and the financial sector, and the Forks and that whole region in Winnipeg, there's a map of Babylon in there. Like, it's basically a replication of Babylon, but at a much smaller scale between the different landmarks and architectural centers. One other thing I want to bring up here, I'll just bring it up if I can. So I noticed this while I was doing this. If I can bring this over here. Can I bring it over there? There we go. Sorry, I'm having trouble here. Okay, so this should be in frame now. So, as we can see here, that I noticed this while I was doing the research, there's actually the Eye of Providence right here, staring at you from the front of the building. Here's the upper lid, here's the lower lid, here's the iris and the pupil of the eye, and then you got the light coming out, the beams of light, like the Eye of Providence. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up. It's the Freemasonic eye, one of the ones that people say is a big sign of the Illuminati. So once you notice that the Eye of Providence is also here at the front of the building staring at you, you'll never forget that. You can see it here now clearly, that there's an eye here hidden in plain sight, which is a Freemasonic motto, by the way, hiding in plain sight. So another thing that you'll see here, if we go back to here, you can barely see it, but you can see where I'm pointing, here and here, these are sphinxes. It's hard to see them if you don't know what you're looking for, but if you go up to the roof, this is what they actually look like. The Manitoba Legislative building features two Egyptian sphinxes on its roof, positioned on either side of the main pediment. These sphinxes, sculpted by Albert Hodge, are inscribed with hieroglyphics referring to the ancient pharaoh Thutmose III, which some interpretations link to Masonic philosophy, the building's Hermetic code, and hidden symbolism. The architect, Frank Worthington Simon, incorporated various ancient pagan and religious symbols alongside Masonic and classical elements into the Beaux Arts design to convey a deeper meaning about society. So, they're located on either side of the pediment. As we were just looking, you can barely see them, but if you go to the building, you can see them up there. They just kind of, they don't look like sphinxes until you really realize that they're there. Again, hiding in plain sight. We can go to the sphinxes bear hieroglyphic inscriptions. The exterior inscription reads, "The good God who gives life." The interior includes a cartouche with an oval on the solar disk, referring to the name of Pharaoh Thutmose III. The architect, Frank Worthington Simon, was a classically trained architect, known for his use of symbolism. The building is considered hermetic, meaning it contains coded messages and symbolic meanings hidden in plain view, often incorporating Freemasonic themes, classical Greek and Roman, and ancient Egyptian elements. So here in the last video, I was looking at this and I said, my interpretation of the inscription is that this is Capri, this is the solar raft, and this is the solar disk, which would then make sense. Like, they're saying it refers to Thutmose III, but I think that the inscription is referring to Capri with the sun raft and the sun, and Capri is associated with Ra. He was like Ra's servant. He's the scarab beetle that carries Ra around on his sun raft in Egyptian mythology. And this Sphinx here is very important because if you see the Sphinx here and then you see the Sphinx below here, we'll go to the next slide, which I grabbed one slide from the last presentation because this is important, that I believe this is evidence that where we're at here in the Manitoba Legislative building is supposed to represent Memphis, which was the ancient capital of Egypt. So I won't go into this whole slide because I went into it in the last video, but we can look at the Memphis Sphinx, also known as the Alabaster Sphinx. It's a large alabaster sculpture located at Memphis Museum in Mit-Rehina, Egypt, near the ancient capital of Memphis. It's a 26-foot long, 16-foot tall sphinx carved during the 18th dynasty. Though the pharaoh it honors, likely Thutput or Amenhotep II, is unknown, the sphinx once adorned the temple complex of the chief god of Memphis, Ptah, and remains a significant testament to ancient Egyptian artistry and devotion. The main reason why I think that this points to it being Memphis is that if we look here, this is the Alabaster Sphinx. It's made of alabaster. It does not have an inscription, but it is very, very similar. It's got the cobra on the head. A lot of the facial features are very similar. This one's, of course, deteriorated, but this is almost a one-to-one replica, other than the few things that have been changed, like the inscription on the chest. And this is also, I'm sure, made of alabaster. I might be incorrect about that, but if this is an alabaster sphinx and this is an alabaster sphinx, then it's kind of pointing to the legislative building being a representation of Memphis, Egypt. And that would make sense for the overall map that I did in episode 1 of parts of Winnipeg being a miniaturism of Babylon, because Memphis was controlled by Babylon for a while in the peak of its empire. So the first thing when you walk into the building here, and you can see here, there's 2 bison. Just this area in general, it just looks like a temple. When you walk into this place, it looks like a temple. This is what it looks like inside. I've been there a couple times, and every single time, I think it's a breathtaking place to be. But there's also a lot of creepy energy, like it's the way the sound reverberates in the building, and just everything puts your hair on end. The Manitoba Legislative building features 2 large, life-size bronze bison statues flanking the main entrance of the grand staircase, symbolizing the plains bison herds that once roamed the province's prairies, and serving a function similar to sacred bulls guarding temple entrances in ancient Near East, created by George Gardet, the sculpture of the Golden Boy. These powerful figures are a significant part of the building's symbolic and classical architecture. So, these are supposed to be protective spirits that guard the entrance to the temple, and that reminds me a lot of the Lamassu. A Lamassu is a protective Assyrian deity or spirit, often depicted as a giant winged, human-headed bull or lion that served as a guardian of palaces and cities. Appearing in Mesopotamia during the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, these massive sculptures carved from single blocks of stone symbolized the immense power, wisdom, and strength of the king, while the wings represented speed and knowledge. They were placed at the entrances of important structures and are considered ancient examples of the double aspect relief, designed to be viewed from both the front and the side. So from the front and the side. Also here you can look at the bison. They're kind of got that flat side to them, so they're designed to be looked at from the front and from the side. So I believe that these are like the ancient bulls, but more like Lamassu guarding the entranceway here, and the connection is obvious when you look at them side by side. Also, Assyria is another connection to Memphis, because Assyria conquered Memphis, Egypt, and Assyria and Babylon, they actually fought over the region. So there was warring between Assyria and Babylon as they tried to control Memphis and parts of Egypt in that time period. So that's another connection and possible link to Manitoba Legislative Building being Memphis in the big overall map of Babylon, which was what episode 1 was about. So now we'll go to the Golden Boy, and things from here get very interesting. A lot more symbolic, talking about alchemy, talking about Hermeticism and numerology, and these deeper ideas, which, if you're not a Hermeticist or a numerologist, probably have no idea about any of this, but we'll go through it here today. So the Golden Boy atop the Manitoba Legislative Building is a statue of the Roman god Mercury, who is equivalent of the Greek god Hermes. The statue represents the province's prosperity and entrepreneurial spirit. So we'll go into some facts about the Golden Boy before we get into the deeper meanings here. Its official name of the statue is the Eternal Youth and Spirit of Enterprise. It's modeled after the Roman god Mercury, which we just talked about, with the sculptor George Gordet possibly drawing inspiration from Giovanni de Bologna 16th century sculpture of the Flying Mercury. The statue depicts a nude young man in a running pose, holding a torch in his right hand and a sheaf of golden grain in his left. There's some symbolism here, surface level symbolism. The runner's pose represents the race that youth will enter in life. So when you're youth becoming an adult, you enter the race, the rat race of capitalist society, let's say. The sheaf of grain symbolizes agriculture, the foundation of the province's economy. The Golden Boy faces north, a gesture meant to recognize the province's natural resources in that direction. There's a lot of resources in the northern Manitoba that are untapped even today. So now we'll go into the more Hermetic side of things and the deeper symbolism of the Golden Boy and its perch and what everything means. So Mercury, who has an equivalent in the Greek god Hermes. Hermes is also seen in an alchemical sense to be Hermes Trismegistus, or the thrice greatest Hermes, who is a legendary Hellenistic figure and a syncretic combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. That's very interesting. Remember Thoth. He is revered as the purported author of the Hermetica, a diverse body of ancient and medieval philosophical writings that formed the basis of Hermeticism, a spiritual philosophy influencing alchemy, astrology, and magic. The term hermetically sealed comes from his association with the airtight techniques used in alchemy. So he's a syncretic figure, we just talked about that, which is a combination of two other figures from Greek and Egyptian traditions. His name, Trismegistus, is Greek for thrice greatest, a title given to the Egyptian god Thoth, who was identified with the Greek messenger god Hermes. Hermes Trismegistus is credited with writing a collection of texts known as the Hermetica, which include the famous Emerald Tablet and the Corpus Hermeticum. The Emerald Tablet is very interesting because it mentions like Atlantis and stuff, which we'll get into a little bit in this, but not too deep. Like people coming from Atlantis and ancient civilizations that preceded the Greek and Roman Empire. These writings expound on a diverse range of topics, including theology, cosmology, and spiritual practice, advocating for spiritual perfection and a path to divine knowledge known as Gnosis, which Gnosis doesn't necessarily refer to Gnostics, but there is some interesting clues in here that you can draw conclusions from Gnosticism as well inside of the building. Alchemists and mysticists view him as their patron, particularly due to the Emerald Tablet's foundational role in alchemy and its influence on practices like distillation. Okay, so we went over Hermes Trismegistus. Now let's look at what the actual character here at the top of the building, the statue, means from an alchemical sense. So Mercury, in alchemy, was believed to be the metal that you would have to react with some other metal to create gold, the philosopher's stone. So the fact that we have Mercury, who is sheathed in gold standing at the top of the building. This is an alchemical allegory right here, for one. He is at the top here. He's the gold philosopher's stone, which also can be interpreted as enlightenment, outside of just being transmutation. He's surrounded on all four sides here, in the four cardinal directions, by gargoyles, and these gargoyles represent the four classical elements of alchemy, which are wind, water, fire, and earth. So if you have the four elements here, wind, water, fire, and earth, pointing in the cardinal directions, then the thing in the center, above all the four classical elements, would have to be ether or the aether. So it's also another representation, another allegory for ether or aether, and an ethereal form at the top of the building above all. So that's a couple interesting connections here with what the Golden Boy actually represents and what the surrounding architecture represents, and how that points to him representing the Philosopher's Stone or Enlightenment at the top of the building. We'll go to the next page here. So now we're going to go into numerology and some other symbolism and astrological meanings inside of the building. So the Manitoba Legislative Building and numerology. The Manitoba Legislative Building contains extensive numerological codes and hidden symbols incorporated into its design by its Freemason architect, Frank Worthington Simon. Many of these numerological themes were decoded by architectural historian Frank Albo, who detailed his findings in the book The Hermetic Code and established a popular tour based on his research. So we'll go into some of the different numerological connections here. The first one is 666. The main entrance hall is a perfect square measuring 66.6 feet by 66.6 feet on each side. While associated with the devil in Christian lore, in Hermetic philosophy it symbolizes the number of the sun, which the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians represented the sun god that ruled over the 36 constellations. The sum of the numbers from 1 to 36 is 666. So that's very interesting right there, that first connection with 666. We talked about the Holy of Holies and Solomon's temple being 66.6 by 66.6 feet. We can also talk about that the whole building itself is actually 666 by 666 feet. So the Holy of Holies built representation inside the building is 1/10 of the whole of the building, which is another harmonic ratio. 1/10 is a harmonic ratio. Let's continue on. Astrological alignment. The building's cornerstone was laid on June 3rd, 1948 at 5:30 p.m. at a moment when the planets Mercury, Hermes, and Venus, Ishtar, were aligned over Winnipeg. The ceremonial opening of 1920 occurred during another astrological alignment of these planets. So this is very interesting. This specific astrological alignment was chosen. I'm not exactly sure much about astrology, but what I can tell you is that there's a mythological analogy here with Mercury and Venus. So Mercury being the messenger god, a god of knowledge, a god of speed to some degree, of like the speed of giving knowledge to others, and then Venus being the equivalent of like an Aphrodite, was the god of love, of sex, and of relationships. When Mercury and Venus got together and had their illegitimate child, that illegitimate child was Cupid in Roman mythology. So Cupid is another love god, a god of love, of relationships, and of stability. And I feel this is very interesting. Although I don't know much about the astrological side of things, I do know that from a mythological perspective, Cupid could be the reason why, trying to represent Cupid could be the reason why they did it on this specific date, these specific dates, from an astrological alignment perspective. The Pool of the Black Star. This pool, located directly beneath the dome and the Golden Boy, is the shape of an 8-pointed star associated with the Babylonian goddess Ishtar and the planet Venus. When someone stands in the center of the room and whispers, the building's acoustics cause their voice to echo throughout the space, mimicking the resonant effect of ancient temples. So the Pool of the Black Star. After this part, we're going to go into a bunch about the Pool of the Black Star because it gets pretty deep and it's actually very dark. It's not like what's on the surface level is it's not that deep, it doesn't seem, but once you dig into it, you'll see that there's a deeper, darker meaning to the Pool of the Black Star. 13. The number 13 is repeated throughout the building. Prominent examples include the bronze bison statues that we talked about, which guard the interior entrance, are 13 feet long. The grand staircase has 3 flights of 13 steps, which is 13, then you would have 26, and then 39, which these are all important numbers in numerology. The archway of the main entrance contains 13 stones. Many lamps in the rotunda and hallways have 13 bulbs. And then there's one interpretation, which is a biblical interpretation, that suggests the number 13 refers to the Christ and his 12 apostles. Others connect it to the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio. So if you think about that, like the Last Supper, for instance, where Jesus tells the apostles about someone betraying him, one of them will betray him, which was Judas. Christ in the center, and then 6 on either side would be the equivalent of 13. I didn't put it in here because I don't want to go way down the Illuminati rabbit hole today, but there's also the concept of the 13 satanic bloodlines, which that's something you can look up on your own if you want to know. But there's apparently 13 bloodlines that have been destined to rule the world by Satan. I'm not religious. I'm just going with the content, and I'm trying to be unbiased and receptive to what they're trying to tell me here so I can understand. But I myself am not a religious person. Let's move on to the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio. Sequences of 5s and 8s are usually built into the architecture. Are also built into the architecture, sorry. Representing numbers found in the Fibonacci sequence, which is 3, 5, 8, 13. When any number in the sequence is divided by the one before it, the ratio approximates the golden ratio 1.618, which is considered an aesthetically perfect proportion and appears in many classical architectural designs, as well as in many different forms of art. And if you think about something like the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, that's another example. So there's a connection to the Da Vinci Code here, the Hermetic Code and the Da Vinci Code, which the Da Vinci Code was a work of fiction, but it was all about the Illuminati and their symbolism inside of Rome and the Catholic Church, things like that. And here we have the Fibonacci sequence encoded into the architecture of this building. So that's a connection that, if you want to look into the Da Vinci Code or read that book, you can see how the Hermetic Code, Frank Albo's book, and how the similarities there between the Fibonacci sequence, how that's kind of a link to a greater numerological code that exists beyond just Winnipeg. Hermes and the Golden Boy alignment. The building's centerpiece is the dome topped by the Golden Boy statue, the interpretation of the Greek god Hermes or Roman god Mercury. Below, in the center of the interior rotunda, is the pool of the Black Star, which symbolizes the altar of the temple. Architect Simon designed these features so that they are in precise alignment with each other, referencing the Hermetic principle of as above, so below. So, on the top you have the Philosopher's Stone, who could also represent the sun god, or there's many different analogies that you can use for the golden boy at the top, but it's a divine being, and beneath the divine being, in a direct line straight down, whoop, to the pool of the Black Star, which is an altar, and also what I believe is a sacrificial chamber, or designed to be like one. And we'll go into that in the next slides here, because it starts to get dark. Egyptian symbolism. The 2 sphinxes on the roof. The Egyptian hieroglyphics are not visible from the ground, but can be found on the chest. The inscription translates to the everlasting manifestation of the sun god Ra, the good god who gives life. So that's another interesting thing, right? Because on our last slide, when we looked at it, it was conflicting information telling us about Thutmose III, which I have read in some Freemasonic literature. I've read that it's supposed to be Thutmose III, but also the inscription itself literally translates to um, the everlasting manifestation of the sun god Ra, the good god who gives life, which then goes into the whole idea of sun gods and a temple to sun god worship, with the philosopher's stone here with the golden boy actually representing a sun god, and this being a sacrificial chamber or an altar to the sun god. So there's different interpretations inside of the building. Biblical references. The building's floor plan and some room dimensions are said to match those of King Solomon's temple, and the lieutenant governor's office is meant to represent the temple's innermost sanctum. A statue of Moses holding the Ten Commandments is also seen inside the speaker's chair in the legislative chamber. We'll get to this in the last slide. I have some stuff to talk about with Moses. Now, let's go on to the next slide. The Pool of the Black Star. So from here on out, we'll be talking about the Pool of the Black Star, because it's very important and gets very dark. It leads you there. The Pool of the Black Star is a circular subterranean chamber beneath the Manitoba Legislative Building's rotunda, featuring a central 8-pointed black marble star. This architecturally significant room serves as a spiritual and symbolic center, situated directly under the Golden Boy, with acoustics designed to converge sound at its core, which is associated with Hermes and the power of speaking in fifths. The space has been detailed by the University of Winnipeg professor Frank Albo in his work on the building's secret spiritual history. Sorry, I got something in my throat. So here's the Pool of the Black Star. Well, this is what it looks like, and here's the Black Star itself. We can look at some of the symbolism that they talk about here. The star is aligned with the Golden Boy in the building's dome, symbolizing the connection between the spiritual and the earthly. It's associated with the goddess Ishtar and Venus in some interpretations. This design allows for sound to enter the building to converge at the center of the star. So if you stand here, if you stand here, you can hear everything from throughout the whole entire building, which is very trippy. Oh my god, sorry. My mouse is being glitchy. The room is considered a spiritual oasis as a part of the building's intricate spiritual symbolism explored by expert Frank Albo. Sound and voice. When standing in the center of the Black Star, one's voice is said to resonate in fifths, a harmonic concept linked to the Greek god Hermes and the idea of speaking with great power. So, a little bit of a tangent here from a musical perspective. 1 second. Okay, sorry. From a musical perspective, a fifth is one of the harmonic intervals. You got thirds, fifths, sevenths. These are all harmonic intervals. In some cases, fourths and um, fourths and sixths can be considered harmonic, but they're usually minor. If you want to go through the major scale, it's thirds, fifths, sevenths, ninths. And when you play a power chord on guitar, which is used a lot in rock and heavy metal music, you have, let's say, my finger is on the third fret on the first string, and my other finger is on the fifth fret of the second string. I'm playing the fifth of the third note of that first finger, and then you slide that up and down, you get power chords. This is used again for establishing power, like powerful riffs in guitar based music. So there's a connection here, not just with Hermetic principles and harmonic geometry, but also this idea of power and using fifths is very familiar from a musical sense, and establishing that kind of control over your audience. Now, let's go here underneath where I have the Pool of the Black Star and the Black Star itself. I have a little excerpt here from Francis Bacon's New Atlantis book, and it's in Old English, so forgive me because it's hard to read this kind of stuff. But we have alpha sound hooves, where we practice and demonstrate all sounds in their generation. We have harmonies which you have not, of quarter fawns, and leafer slides and sounds. Divers instruments of music like wife to you unknown. Some sweeter than you have, with bells and rings that are dainty and sweet. We represent sounds as great and deep, like wife great sounds, extenuating and sharp. We make divers tremblings and warblings of sounds, which in their original are entire. We prevent and imitate all architecture, or all articulate sounds and letters. and the voices and notes of beasts and birds. We have certain helps which fet the ear and do further cheeringly great. We have alpho divers. We have also divers strange and artificial echoes reflecting the voice many times as if it were toffing it, and some to give back to the voice louder than it came. Some thrillers and some deeper, yea, some rendering a voice differing the letters of articulate sound from that they receive. We have all means to convey sounds in trunks and pipes and strange lines in distances. So this is essentially what this is referring to. It's in Old English. It's weird, um, but the idea is that in the book New Atlantis, after they set up and established their new Atlantean empire, they create one chamber in the center of the empire, and that building allows for sound to reverberate into the center of the building. And then it also has down here, we have means to convey sounds, trunks and pipes, and strange lines and distances. So this is basically the idea, like, because Winnipeg is in the center of Manitoba, it is believed that in the book, when these sounds were put inside this chamber, they would be passed along the ley lines or whatever. So whatever energy or intention was said inside the main chamber would then reverberate through the whole of the Atlantean Empire. And if you're thinking about it from the concept, like from that perspective of ley lines and um, there being connections, like geographically throughout the world, then Winnipeg would be the perfect place to pick to come and do your sacrifices, let's say, or to do your chanting and your droning, because the intention would then be passed throughout the whole of North America and potentially the whole of the world, because this is the center of North America, as we talked about in episode 1. Going on that idea of sacrifices, and you might be wondering why I keep saying that, we're going to get into that on this slide here. So the term pool of the Black Star sacrifice likely refers to the historical description found in the old guidebook in 1925 about the pool of the Black Star at the Manitoba Legislative building, which describes an altar and sanctuary with associated elements of sacrifice like a priest, god, victim, and a knife. While the building is now a center for lawmakers, the design intentionally references ancient temples and their sacred spaces, including altars, and the pool of the Black Star symbolizes the sanctuary and the altar found in ancient temples. So the eight-pointed star in the center of the floor represents the pole star, symbolic reference to an altar in ancient temples. We'll go to the sacrifice connection here. 1925 guidebook from the building describes the pool of the Black Star as a place that would have been housed an altar, a priest, a god's image, and a victim, and a curved knife for ancient sacrifices. So we're going to come over here. A specific 1925 guidebook from the pool of the Black Star is not publicly available, so I haven't read this myself, but the 1925 guidebook, as mentioned by the tour guide, contained a description of the room as a sacrificial site, which they were told not to share. The pool of the Black Star is a room in the Manitoba Legislative building with an 8-pointed star, black marble star at its center, and its location within many esoteric and symbolic features. So, the tour guide mentioned that the 1925 guidebook described the pool of the Black Star as a place for a dark ritualistic sacrifice. The description allegedly included an altar, a priest, a god's image, a victim, and a curved knife. A circle of white-robed worshippers around the edge of the pool. The floor would be stained, and dull red stains trickle through the black veins of the marble, indicating sacrifice. The Black Star itself was perfectly positioned for this sacrifice beneath the god that they were worshipping, in this case the sun god Ra, or maybe Hermes. But so there's a deeper meaning here, right, of this being a sacrificial chamber. And this building that I included here, as you can see, this is not the same as this building here. But what this building is, this is Wewelsburg Castle in Germany, which was used by the SS. And there's theories that they did, because the SS was into black magic, rune magic, stuff like that. There's theories that they used this exact pit here, the sacrificial pit, for human sacrifices, thinking that they would gain power from that. So we'll go to here with the Nazi connection and the SS and Wewelsburg Castle. Wewelsburg Castle is a Renaissance castle in Germany that became a central ideological and cult site for the Nazi SS during the Third Reich. Commissioned by SS leader Heinrich Himmler, the castle and its surrounding area were meant to be the center of the world for a new Germanic empire. Today, the castle operates as a museum and memorial dedicated to the complex and dark history. So it started, the early history was the Weiser Renaissance style, which was built in 1603 to 1609 by Prince Bishop Dietrich von Fürstenberg of Paderborn. The castle is noted for its unique triangular layout with 3 towers and connecting walls. A checkered past. Prior to its Nazi association, the castle was damaged during the 30 Years' War and was later rebuilt and was a site for witch trials in the 7th century. Again, witch trials would be another, you know, sacrifices in a different sense, right? By the 1920s, after coming under ownership of the district of Buren, the castle served as a museum, restaurant, and youth hostel. And then the Nazis took it over, so the acquisition by Himmler. In 1934, Himmler leased the castle for 100 years with plans to transform it into a central SS meeting and training center. The castle was intended to become an SS school focused on Germanic prehistory, mythology, and folklore to justify racial doctrines of the SS. Under Himmler's direction, the castle's interior was heavily modified to incorporate Nazi SS symbolism, and rooms were given names from Arthurian and Germanic legends such as Grail and King Arthur. So, the reason why I bring up this specific room of Wewelsburg Castle is because if we look at Wewelsburg Castle here, and we come back here, we can see that there's a lot of similarities in how these are built. First of all, we have right here, which is where the swastika, the Undenskross is. We can see that is above the sacrificial pit, just like we can see here with the rotunda, which goes up to the golden boy, and then down here we have the sacrificial pit. We can use this image here just so that we don't have to jump back and forth that far. You can see that there's the 4 lights, right? There's actually 8 lights all around, but here we have we have a similar architectural design. So they're not exact, but considering we're talking about the fasces and stuff like that earlier in the thing, and the idea of totalitarianism and fascism, I find it very interesting how closely related this is to Wewelsburg Castle, and I find it hard not to believe that it wasn't designed based off of a sacrificial pit like this. Perhaps this specific pit, which is what my belief is, and I think I have some evidence for that. One piece of evidence of that is that um, there was a event during World War II when they were trying to get war bonds for the Canadian government, and what they did in Winnipeg is they did something called If Day. And what If Day was it was this hypothetical situation where imagine if the Nazis took over for one day, what would that look like? And so they did a whole bunch of stuff on If Day. They had people from the government and just volunteers dress up as Nazi SS soldiers with full uniforms, with the black helmets, the whole thing. They were walking around. They were asking people for their papers and stuff like that. They they canceled the free press for one day and put out like a Nazi newspaper, which had all state propaganda about Nazis winning the war. And then the one thing that I found very interesting is that they renamed the city for one day during If Day Himmlerstadt, which meant like Himmler's city, right? And I just found that very interesting. Like that's one of the main reasons why I think that like there was something else going on there uh, in If Day when they named Winnipeg Himmlerstadt, and then seeing like the pool of the Black Star, this dark symbolism, how close that is to Wewelsburg's dark symbolism, Heinrich Himmler's connection, and then Winnipeg being renamed Himmlerstadt because of its, you know, maybe because of the like Himmler like places that had mystical connections or that had like uh, Hermetic archaeology and stuff like that. He was interested in that kind of stuff. So the pool of the Black Star is a lot darker. There's something else going on there. Um, I think it's about sacrifices. I think it is modeled after Wewelsburg. There's ideas like that present throughout this specific room in the building. But we're going to go to our last slide here. And we're just going to talk about Moses, who was mentioned before. So here's Moses, and here's Solon, and this is in the speaker's chamber um, of the building where people will have political debates. The thing that I find interesting about Moses, though, is that going back to the darker themes, darker side of themes here, because when the Freemasons tell you, like when Frank Albo, for instance, when he tells you about the building, everything's all, oh, it's all happy-go-lucky, it's all Hermeticism, it's all positive stuff. They don't talk about the darker side of things that are represented here. One of these darker side of things is that if you look at Moses here with his 10 Commandments and the tablets that were supposed to be in the Ark of the Covenant on the top of the building, let's say, you can see here that he's got horns. And this is very interesting because if we look here at this little blurb here, this is another thing I made years ago. The depiction of the horned Moses stems from the description of Moses' face as cornuta in Hebrew, horned, in the Latin Vulgate translation of the passage found in Exodus chapter 34, especially verses 39, 30, or 29, 30, and 35, in which Moses returns to the people after receiving the commandments for the second time, Michelangelo. So Michelangelo's depiction, the reason why that he put horns on it, as well as all these other depictions, because in the Hebrew version and in the Latin Vulgate, which is a literal translation, when he comes down from Mount Sinai, he's got horns. So he goes up there, a regular human being, and he comes down and he's got horns growing out of the top of his head all of a sudden. And that's actually in the Hebrew scripture. So it's very interesting to me that when they talk about God or anything, so when they talk about Satan, I should say, Satan is always referred to as this being, oh, with horns and dark skin and cloven hooves and all this kind of thing. But then when we look at the depictions of their own heroes, of their own prophets, they have horns. And there's a connection here to like the order of the horn gods, or if we think about something like Cernunnos or Pan. And Cernunnos is an interesting one because I remember years ago there was the sacrifice that they say was a mock sacrifice at the CERN building in front of that uh, Shiva statue. The way they describe it here, sorry for my little tangent, but I'm going to go back here. The way that they describe it with the altar, the priest, the victims, and then you would have a circle of white robe worshippers around the edge of the pool, that kind of thing. When you look at that video, if you can find that video, go look it up. When they come walking out, they're all dressed in robes like that. They surround the person and they do their sacrifice with a curved knife. It's the same concept that is happening here. So there's some like this practice throughout many different religions around the world, many different cults. They all do the same thing for some reason, and they're usually worshiping some kind of horned god, some kind of Cernunnos Pan, something that has horns, right? Or El, uh, you know, Baal Hadad. These are all horned entities that represented by things with horns and with connections to bulls. So I want to talk about the Moses connection here because we kind of have like a little battle here, a battle of speech and dictation between, you have Solon on the right hand side, who was a lawmaker and is claimed to be Atlantean by the Greeks, like he's an Atlantean descendant. And then we have Moses here, who is on the left, and he's depicted as having horns and having this kind of demeanor, this ferocious demeanor kind of getting in his face, right? Where Solon's kind of sitting here, kind of displaying signs of like protectivism, insight, like psychological behavioral signs of he's just trying to stay to himself and just trying to do his thing. Well, Moses is out here pointing his finger, wagging his finger at Solon, basically trying to inundate Solon with his ideology, right? Is how I interpret this little connection between the two in the speaking chamber. Last thing I want to talk about, this is already an hour and 5 minutes long, so The eight-pointed star in chaos magic is a symbol of chaos, representing the infinite possibilities and unpredictable nature of reality. Called the chaos star or the chaos sphere, it was adopted from fantasy literature and became the official symbol of the prominent chaos magic organization. So, chaos magic. We're talking about like also like Thelema and Aleister Crowley and stuff like that. Again, Aleister Crowley called himself the Beast. The Beast is associated with Satan and horned beings, right? The horns are a sign of a beast. If you look at the eight-pointed star here, the in the pool, the black star, and you think about this here, the chaos star, they're identical. Well, very close to identical. Like I could overlay this on there, and it would be relevant. So even though they say that it's the star of Ishtar or Inanna and Venus, when I see it, I think immediately of chaos magic and, the chaos magic side, the Thelema side, the darker, satanic or left-hand path ideologies that lines more up with sacrificial chambers, um, with darker ideas like that, which aren't exactly present with, like, there's no evidence of Ishtar being a god that people would sacrifice to. Of course, people would sacrifice to all sorts of gods back then, but Ishtar in particular wasn't a god that demanded sacrifice as much as, you know, later gods, mostly horn gods, that demanded sacrifice in their belief systems. So anyways, that's the last slide. This was episode 2 of the series. If you watch this all the way to the end, firstly, thank you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate people listening to this kind of stuff and um, following through with my ideas as, you know, how I see this and sharing that to people. I really want to be able to share this stuff because I feel it's very important. There will be more videos coming, hopefully. I want to make a whole series about this, maybe 5 or 6 videos in total. In the different buildings. I want to do at least for sure the Human Rights Museum and the Oodina, and then I might do some other stuff inside of Winnipeg too. And that's it. This was episode 2, which was the Manitoba Masonic history and the Manitoba Legislative building. Thank you for watching. If you got this far, I very much appreciate it.